Welcome back to our World Chess Championship Made Simple series. And today, in Game 6 of the World Chess Championship, we finally have a breakthrough, and I have these gigantic tasks to show and try to explain what went on and how did Magnus Carlsen finally win against Jan Nepomniachtchi. So we start off with Magnus being white, and he's playing Jan for the second time in the d4 systems. So usually we got some sort of a Catalan. So in the previous games, we got something along the lines of c4, e6, knight f3, d5, and g3. And this is called the Catalan system. Yet today we had something a little bit different. Even though it started with a queen pawn again, this time around it was a double fianchetto system. It doesn't really have a name because the whole idea is you just fianchetto your bishops for white. And he's not going to try to force things. He's not going to try to get a winning advantage out of the opening, but he's going to try to delay that till the middle game and try to beat Jan in the middle game and end game, which is what happened. Now, out of the opening, Jan is very, very solid. Black is just getting the center, trying to destroy what little of the center white has remaining. And white is going to say it's okay. It's not a problem because I don't really care about the center if I can pressure it from the side. So this is the type of hyper modern chess that's really popular nowadays. And white says, I'm not going to try to break through with e4. No, I'm going to fire on this diagonal and that diagonal. Let's see what you do. Okay. The thing about taking on c4 is that if white takes back, then the pawn chain is ruined. And you don't want to have that many pawn islands, right? So the idea that Carlsen started to implement to show here is queen c2. And he's saying, hey, how about later on, you can even take my pawn. Not right now because I'm pinning your pawn, but maybe later on you can even take and I'll get some sort of a gambit where I'm pressuring down the A file, down the diagonal. How do you feel about a pawn? What do you think? And black says, no, thank you. And white says, what about now? How do you feel about the pawn? You want to take it? It's one last chance to take it. And no. So after black doesn't take the pawn, he wants nothing to do with the gambit. It's too risky. White just takes it back. He gets the knight where it wants to go, and the bishop's coming to b2, a very flexible position for both sides. Black says, I need the bishop out. And the only way I can do that is with b5. After kicking out the knight, and kicking out the queen, we finally get the pieces rolling. The bishops are out, the knights have good squares. Black shouldn't really complain at this point, and I think black should actually be happy coming out of this opening because they got everything they needed. They have a little target on b5. I'm not too happy about the pawn on b5 because sometimes they can bite on it, sometimes it becomes weak. But after a6, it can also become a space thing. Black can say, ooh, I have more space than you, which is kind of what happens. Okay. After a3, the knight kicks out the bishop. The black pieces have to go back, but black is extremely solid. Should be very happy with this position. The only thing Magnus got going for him is he can double up pawns. But the thing about Magnus is he doesn't need a lot. He just takes a little bit, doubles up those pawns, and takes it all the way to the end game. And basically wins because of these pawns. Now, to be honest, black should be totally fine here because the bishop pair is just as important as the pawn triangle and the isolated pawn on h7. Okay, of course we're not going to take with the queen and go to an endgame right away because then Magnus can torture us even faster. But no, we can take with the pawn and say, how is your king side feeling? How is your queen? I'm a big fan of hers. Can she go away even further and so she can't do anything in her life? And that's what will happen in the game because after knight d4, the knight's trade, and the queen hides, the queen is nowhere to be seen. And even though the bishop pair goes away, the bishops are traded, we get a bishop versus knight battle. Okay. Now, in this battle, the knight can say that the pawn structure is broken, and maybe I can get an outpost, maybe I can scare your king. And black will say, what king? What attack? I don't see any attack. My bishop holds the dark squares, I'll put everything on light squares, and good luck trying to use the pawns in any endgame. That's a minuscule, tiny advantage that most people in the world would not even care about. But let's see why Carlsen starts caring about it. Okay, after check, queen e4, it turns out that around here, Jan was a little uncareful. or not careful, or just negligent because he stops caring about this rook on a8 and it has a hard time coming out. Okay, maybe earlier on, maybe just rook c8 playing normal chess is also fine, but in the actual game, the rook wasn't allowed to come here because of the queen. Okay, Magnus is trying to say your rook is bad and maybe I can invade while my other rook comes to d1. Okay, black holds everything and keeps it together. White says no problem. Let me just super defend everything, make sure everything is safe. It's all defended. And then we'll keep asking that question about your rook. Hey, what are you doing? My rooks are good. What about yours? You gonna come here, do nothing? Maybe you're gonna come there, but even then, I have the open file. You don't. In these positions, you prefer to have the file further from the kings. So let's say there's a C file and a D file. You prefer to have the C file because it's further, and so it's easier to get stuff in the end game. It's easier to eat stuff away from the king. The king has a harder time coming to get the c file. All right. For that reason, Jan says, go for it. Take my rooks. And even after we trade, this is the first transformation of the day where there are two rooks against a queen. Now, the good thing for black is that even though the two rooks are supposed to be a little bit better, they're not really working well right now. They're not coordinated. There's a target on b3. It's not so easy to help it. The only way to help it is with b4. And even after b4, now your pawns are stuck on my favorite color, where my bishop will love to tickle them, okay? And as I start tickling your pawns, your rooks will have a choice, either to defend them and be stuck around this guy, as my queen comes and tries to invade, or you can try to give up the pawn, which Carlsen does, okay? So after a few moves, we get this position where finally Jan takes the pawn. That's a risky choice because, first of all, the bishop is semi-trapped, okay? He's not completely trapped. He has some bishop takes before ideas, but, you know, not so easy. It's a pawn trade, so you don't even win the pawn on a3. And the bishop is very close to being trapped, okay? If he wanted to take that guy, maybe he should have done it earlier. Maybe around here he could have gone for bishop b2. If the knight takes, I take your rook. If the rook takes, I take your knight. Okay, so after this gigantic battle of bishop versus knight, he finally goes for the pawn and gets his bishop trapped. Okay, now the queen has to try and prevent the evil rook, and the rook has to get ready to eat the bishop anyways. At this point, somewhere around move 40, this is the critical part where if Magnus played rook dc2, that's where he had the biggest advantage. Okay, the bishop is stuck, it can't move, the knight is perfect, the queen can't move because it's tied down to the bishop, and that's the best chance Magnus had at winning right away. The queen cannot move, the bishop cannot move, the pawn cannot move, only the king can move. Okay, in the meantime, white can try to make progress. I would look into maybe even knight takes a4, because after knight takes, queen takes, a rook here, I'll pin your bishop, win the bishop, and try to torture you in the endgame. Because your pawns are weak, the rooks have a good chance of winning these weak targets. Okay, for that reason, he said, no, 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 let me try for something else. In the game, Magnus did not see rook c2. He took the pawn, and we got an equalish position because the bishop is now alive, the queen can move, and the a-pawn is still thriving as well. Okay, it's having a great time, it's having a party because very soon it'll get to a3 and become dangerous. At this point, if anyone could have won the game, it was Jan. Okay, the pawn is defended, the rooks are tied down, and even though, yes, the knight is strong, probably you shouldn't lose with a knight like that, this pawn can be really annoying, and we can combine it with some sort of attack one day in a possible world. But for the most part, white is very safe, so he's not really risking losing as long as this pawn doesn't go anywhere. For that reason, watch how Carlsen maneuvers the rook to make sure this guy will never ever pass the rooks. Okay, this guy is stuck forever. And at this point, I would expect a draw because, okay, the rooks are stuck. The knight is awesome. We're never going to take the knight because then the rooks will get dangerous again, right? It's just a positional draw. Everything is fine. But in the actual game, Magnus went for a risk and Jan allowed it because Magnus sacrifices the rook to get this endgame. Okay. Now, if you take right away, let's say we took with our bishop, right? Rook takes, and we get this endgame. The pawns are all weak. The knight and rook are gonna torture all the pawns because it's very hard to defend them. If you try to defend them with the king and the queen, I can always trade, right? I can trade my rook and knight for your king, for your queen, I should say, and then run my pawns down because the endgames where I trade these guys for those guys are losing for black. Okay. For that reason, Jan has a nice little tactic with queen takes pawn. But even now, the pawn is no stronger. All the white pawns are together. They're forming a party, a pyramid, the strongest shape in the world. They're making sure to stay together. As for black's pawns, help me, help me, help me. They're not doing so great. And so for that reason, black is not having any fun in this endgame. And it's no wonder that he lost from here on in, because already here it's getting hard to play for black. Okay. Now, I call this game Death by Exhaustion because it was really checkmate by exhaustion. First of all, it was hard to play, but on a good day, maybe black could have held a draw. But because of how long this game was, it was maybe 136 moves, the longest game in World Championship history. That's amazing. Okay, because of how long it was, I think Magnus just grinded Jan down until Jan was too exhausted to defend properly. Let's take a look. All right. In the actual game, we got the king making way slowly but surely. He's in no rush. He's got all the time in the world, right? They have very long time control, so the game actually took over 7 hours, 7.5 hours, right? So Black tries to set up a fortress. Black says, "You're not coming into my house. And if you ever chase me, I can always go to h7, f6, and I have enough squares. On top of that, your pawn, sir, is weak. Your pawns are stuck on my favorite color," says the bishop. But it doesn't make a difference because at some point or other, we will take the targets, the ice creams. Okay, so eventually, after another 100 moves. I'm of course kidding. Eventually, he makes enough progress that he can take the pawn on f5. Eventually, Magnus will take the pawn. Now, he allows a little tactic here. What's going to happen is another transformation. We're going to transform the position because before we had queen for two rooks, and now after queen d3, white has a choice. White can try to go here, but then we have this nice little trick, bishop takes. Okay, he can do the same thing with the other rook, but bishop takes. Okay, if the rook takes, queen takes, and same thing after rook takes, queen takes. Okay, and this endgame is a draw because white doesn't have the extra pawns he does in the game. All right, now it's just a rook against a queen, so rook and knight against a queen. That's a simple draw. But in the actual game, we got rook check. He goes for this endgame. Okay, he gives up a rook for a pawn and a bishop, and we arrive at our final transformation. Finally, in this endgame, on move 82, he gets the rook and a knight against the queen. Okay. Yes, the pawns are in white's favor. He has two extra pawns, and this guy is not exactly the pawn you want to have because at one point or other, the king can come and bother it, the knight can come and bother it, the rook can come and bother it, and you don't have enough defenders. The queen is only one friend. Okay, the king is not a good defender. Okay, so this is going to be a tough endgame for black. The only thing black's got going is that maybe the queen is very good at giving checks. Okay, and if you push your pawns too fast, the million checks will really bother your king. Maybe I'll have some fork, just like the one on c5. But even if it's not a fork, it's hard for the king to hide. A lot of people would just get exhausted and say, fine, draw already. But watch how patient Carlsen is. He doesn't care if it takes him 1,000 moves. He's going to win this game. Let's see how. Queen d5, slowly but surely. He sticks the knight on a perfect centralized outpost. He gets ready to annoy the black king. He tickles the target. He makes a little fortress, a little tank to get ready to push the pawn at some point. And if the tank doesn't work because of the pin, we go to another idea. He does all this to exhaust black as well, to tire him out. Because if black has to be careful for 100 moves, on move 133, he's going to make a mistake, as we'll see. All right. On that note, check, check. The knight comes to e5, the next outpost. Okay, he first spins around, sees where the weather is nice, and eventually starts pushing the pawns. Okay, he's still in no hurry because you can push a pawn every 50 moves, and that way you avoid the 50 move rule. Right? He spins the rook around, spins the knight around, finally pushes a pawn, makes way for the king. Okay, this is a really interesting endgame because let's say if one of these pawns are gone, probably it's a draw. But the extra pawn also gives the king some cover, so he can hide from the checks in this case. All right, let's fast forward to the end. Finally, he trades the pawn, and we get this endgame. Two pawns, a rook and a knight against the queen. Is this winning with best play? To be honest, probably not. So the computer is saying, yeah, we can hold a draw. This is a joke. But against Magnus Carlsen, after 7 hours of playing, I don't think anyone in the world would be able to make a draw out of this. Okay? Because White's play is a lot easier, right? White is going to push the rook behind the pawns, make a escape square or a getaway for the king, and then bring the king to help the pawns. The knight will stay centralized, help the rook, and help the king get away. All right, let's see how this endgame plays out. So far, Jan is defending well, and he actually did a pretty good job up to a certain point. Okay, he starts checking, he starts being annoying, he starts checking from here, check whenever possible to get some time, another check, pins the pawn, make sure there are no pawn breaks. Okay, if you push the pawn too soon, we can try to blockade the pawns as well. All right, that's not going to help White. He's very patient. He puts the king on the back rank, okay, and tries to push the pawns now. Because with the king on the back rank, we can finally make progress. As you'll see, the king doesn't feel very good when the pawns come his way. All right. Jan had a better chance to defend. If he was a machine and if he was some Terminator, a robot, maybe he could have held it around here. Around here, he had to try and hold back the king. If the white king is stuck to the third rank, if the white king is stuck here, that's a draw. Okay, that's going to be a draw because he cannot support the pawns, and the white pieces have to watch out for all the checks from behind. Okay, if the knight has to stay around here, then it's going to be a draw. If the knight gets to come over, then the real trouble begins. All right. So at the end of all that, at the end of all this torture, finally, the white king makes his way up. Black chooses the wrong plan. Jan chooses the plan of giving checks from the front, and that doesn't help at all because it just helps white bring forward the pieces and start bothering your king, the black king. Okay, there is no fork yet because of the pin, but it may come soon. All right, here's a cute little trick, and this is the critical point. Finally, after making his way up, Magnus finds this cool move e6. The point is you cannot take too many tricks. Okay, and even if you try to be tricky here, you can never take my pawn because of knight forks. Okay, that's where the king's placement really doesn't help, right? In the final moments, Jan tries to annoy the pawn, but hey, we always have more forks. This endgame would be losing. So if, let's say we go for the fork, takes, and king g5, just in time to help the pawn, that's a winning endgame for white because of opposition. Okay. They both knew that. That's why black does not take the pawn. He tries to run away, but this is just desperation. Finally, the passed pawns support each other, and they can make way to the 8th rank. Now, what about the king? Well, he's going to run a adventure here. He's going to go on a journey. The journey will be all the way, slowly but surely, to g8. Once the king gets here, he helps the pawns, he helps the rook and the knight, no one can check him, and the pawn is ready for blast off. Okay, and that's where Black resigned. Let's say you give him a few checks, the checks will run out one day. Good game. Okay, and that's how Magnus finally won his first game in this World Chess Championship. So it'll be interesting to see how Jan recovers. If he's just gonna die after this game, if he's gonna put up more of a battle, if he tries to play for a win, because I'm sure this was a huge blow after playing for 7 hours and 136 moves. That's quite a tough loss. But we'll see how it goes. So thanks for watching and looking forward to the next game.